Good morning, Safra Taba. The weather here in Pittsburgh is snowy with a chance of really cold. And hey, it's spring, but maybe not. I don't know. We're
Not
here
this
doing
year.
Talmud with our communities, our friends in Kilat HaKerem of Carmiel, Yisrael, and Beth Shalom here in Pittsburgh. We're on page 30b. We're picking up with a Mishnah that we left off with last time. And the rabbis are puzzling over at what point in the day do you flip the calendar forward for when ostensibly the topic they were originally talking about is when does things roll forward for when you can no longer decide whether to intercalate the month. The rabbis would decide whether a month was 29 or 30 days based on the position of the new moon. And that will lead to all manner of chaos going forward. Although the rabbis really dealt with that back in the first parak, and they're just kind of like doing a callback here again. So I'll share our screen with us. If you are learning at home or currently doing your dishes, we're still going to read it out loud for you. We're on, if you're doing the Sefaria, page 30b, starting at subnote. In the Mishnah, it is subnote 5, and we're just going to rippity-doo through that and get to the Gemara. All right, if it's okay with you, Elisheva, you're going to do 5 and 6 for me, because the Hebrew, there's not a lot of it. And this is, again, a small review of the end of last class. Matnitin, our Mishnah. Barishona hayu mekablim edut hachodesh kol hayom. Pamachat nishtahu haedim bilvo v'nit kalkel haleviim bashir. Hitkinu shelo yihiyu mekablim ele ad hamincha.
Mishnah. Initially, they would accept testimony to determine the start of the month throughout the entire 30th day from the beginning of the month of Elul, before Rosh Hashanah. And if witnesses arrived from afar and testified that they had sighted the new moon the previous night, they would declare that day the festival.
Great. Keep going.
Yeah, just pulling the page up. Once the witnesses tarried coming until the hour was late, and the Levites erred with regard to the psalm, that is, the psalm that they were supposed to recite, as they did not know at the time whether it was festival or an ordinary weekday. From that point on, the sages instituted that they would accept testimony to determine the start of the month only until Mincha time. If witnesses had not arrived by that hour, they would declare Elul a 30-day month and calculate the dates of the festivals accordingly.
Great. So the question is, and they kind of like just slow play it. They don't really make a big deal of it, but they kind of imply that or they basically say here that the rabbis would lay down based on what they witnessed of the new moon when the first day of Rosh Hashanah would be. And there seemed to be a very the possibility that they could, that the entire Jewish community would look at their watches and be like, is tomorrow Rosh Hashanah or the day after? And the answer would be, the rabbis will let us know tomorrow. And it'd be like, that's crazy, right? It's crazy that you would have that late a notice. But that's the way that it was done in the old days, that the declaration had to be attested by witnesses, and they did not have the system, right, that we have now of a 19-year calendar in which the lunar calendar is affixed to the solar calendar. They would declare it year by year based on where the position of the new moon would be, and whether it was appropriately kind of intercalated to the solar calendar. Do I understand exactly how they determined this? No, I do not. Calendar is not my jam, as Yeleni will attest. Elisheva, go ahead.
You said to decide whether, if they came very late, whether the holiday would be the next day or the following day. But this sounds like they come all day, and that same day might be declared the holiday, which is why they said the wrong psalm, because it hadn't been declared yet, but retroactively was Chag.
Yeah, that's always been a confusing thing for me. My sense is that you can't retroactively, right? If they come at midday, you can't declare midday, oh, it's actually Rosh Hashanah, because it would change the entire liturgy. I think that they've always been.
It would, but if they saw the new moon the night before, that is the first day.
Yeah, I mean, that has to do with, I think you're right. And there are two things that I think of, right? One, you might be right. Two, we don't really know. We'll never really know. Our medieval commentators are the ones who are going to kind of help us understand that. But one of the things that this kind of implies, and actually we're going to learn more of this as we go on, that the only reason I think that would make sense is if the liturgy for Rosh Hashanah was not particularly robust or different from a regular day. But in fact, the liturgy for Rosh Hashanah is so intricate, and there's so many things that we have to do that it's not possible that they would roll in that day and suddenly decide, oh, so it's got to be that they roll in on Erev Rosh Hashanah and declare that today is on the day of Erev Rosh Hashanah, and they declare that it is to be Rosh Hashanah starting tomorrow. It might be that they declare that today is the beginning of Rosh Hashanah, but the liturgy will play out starting tomorrow, because clearly you can't they don't have a time.
They can't undo the liturgy.
Right.
But there's no way the priest wouldn't hear as soon as the report came.
Right.
And if it came even late at night, they would certainly know by the next day. It's only if it's the same day that it's an issue.
The supposition you're making is a logical one, which I think is possible, which is that, and by the way, a frum rabbi would just look at the commentators, the medieval commentators, and tell you, well, that's what they did. And I am very reticent to assume that because Rashi was living in France 1,000 years later, he knew what they did 1,000 years earlier. But the supposition you're making is very logical, and I agree with it to some degree, which is, it's the reason, by the way, why Rosh Hashanah is a 2-day Yontiv, which is, it's entirely possible that the liturgy on the first day is incomplete because they didn't intercalate the calendar.
It wasn't declared yet.
Until the right time. So that's why you do the whole thing for the second day, right? Which actually would make a lot of sense and would be preferable in the sense that, like, you'd skip Zichronot, Malchuyot, and Shofarot on day 1 because you wouldn't have known that it was actually Rosh Hashanah, and you don't do it till day 2, right? It would make for a shorter service, and we'd all get to lunch earlier, which I'm in favor of.
And specifically, the day before Rosh Hashanah, you don't blow the shofar.
The day before is specifically a day in which you don't blow the shofar, which I have forgotten from time to time. And I
never forget it because I love the reason that's given.
Right.
So that the Acher can't keep track of when the holiday comes.
Yeah, that's also the reason we don't do Hallel, which will show up later in this parak. We actually learned that specifically, I think. But if I'm not mistaken, because I was, for whatever reason, I had to, I think I had to lead Shachrit on Erev Rosh Hashanah this year at Beth Shalom. Usually I'm not at Shachrit because I have to drop off my kids, but clearly we didn't have that. And I'm 95% sure that at Beth Shalom they blew the shofar on Erev Rosh Hashanah. And I was like, I don't think we do this, but
I hope the Acher wasn't after you.
Satan be gone, right? Like I am always. All right, go ahead, Marianne, you have a question, and then we'll keep going.
Yeah. Besides the liturgy and the problems with the prayers in the synagogue, I would think there's also be a big problem unless they had a totally different system for preparing at home for the holiday. That would make a big difference.
By the way, I like the formulation that they drop here, which is that it's a problem for the Levites in the temple, right? They're mostly focused on what was the Levitic issue, and specifically the Levitic issue regarding was the psalm for the day recited, or was the psalm for the holiday recited? That's what they're fixed
That's
on.
what they're focused.
And
Yeah.
for me,
Yeah.
a guy who generally does, I find the psalm for the day to be kind of, I never find it to be a significant part of the prayer service. But I think one of the things that this calls out, and it's interesting because I led tefillah at the day school today, and we only got through about half the prayers because I did a bunch of Tai Chi and a bunch of yoga and a bunch of breathing exercises because, I like to shake things up and confuse people. And seventh graders are seventh graders and they need a break. And the idea that the rabbis occasionally throw out, or at least we have hardwired into us, is, well, prayer X is the most important prayer, or prayer Y is the most important prayer. And this kind of implies that like Shir Shel Yom, or the psalm for Yontiv, is a really important prayer because it merits its own argument in the Mishnah. Whereas, by the way, like Tachanun is a prayer we say in conservative and Orthodox Judaism every day, except when there's a Yontiv or a reason to do it. Tachanun has almost no basis in the Talmud. It only appears once. It appears in the Tanur Shel Achnai story, one of the more famous stories in the entire Talmud, and it has no liturgy. It basically says, you fall on your face, and that's all it says. It doesn't say what you're supposed to say. It was later rabbis who decided to insert words into there. There's a bunch of those prayers where, the Talmud tells us certain prayers are important and doesn't really kind of imply that other prayers are important at all. And over time, we evolve in a different direction. Aleinu is another great example of that. Aleinu is effectively a piyut, a liturgical poem that was added later to the service. It was appended much later. All right, Yeleni, you had a question, and then Rav Judy.
Yeah, so this is a question, I'm not sure. Well, first of all, I mean, a lot of the liturgy we're talking about for Rosh Hashanah is instituted much later, right? So I don't know how much liturgically is different on Rosh Hashanah, like other than like the Psalm. But my question is, hold on, I want to phrase this correctly. So on a regular Rosh Chodesh, we're not talking about Rosh Hashanah. If they come on day and they testify that they saw the new moon, then the day that they testify becomes the first day, and it becomes Rosh Chodesh, and then therefore the sacrifices for Rosh Chodesh are given, correct? Or when they testify, is it the next? Does that mean that the next day is going to be Rosh Chodesh? Not Rosh Hashanah, a regular Rosh Chodesh.
This is a problem that we dealt with like several years ago, of this whole thing of like, all right, well, if they're testifying now, then is now or is now later, right? Is basically the question you're asking. Yeah. Like, do we? And I think the logic of that is what we were just mentioning, which is they can't possibly be implying that it has to have been done this morning if they're allowed to testify all the way through noon, right?
Right. So for a regular Rosh Chodesh, if someone comes and testifies, then the next day is Rosh Chodesh, even if it's not Rosh Hashanah. Okay.
That's the implication, but that's why we have these 2-day Rosh. That's why Elisheva was pointing out that we have these 2-day Rosh Chodeshes, which is the testimony is given, and we're going to need a whole extra day to do all the other stuff that we need to do.
Right. Okay. Because my thought was the biggest thing in terms of if you don't hear the testimony for Rosh Hashanah until even a little bit in the day, is not I know here it's talking about the psalm of the day, but that the Torah says, so it becomes Yom Tov, and that goes all the way back to the beginning of the day. So to me, I know that's not what the Mishnah is talking about, but to me, that seems to be the biggest issue if you suddenly testify, oh, now is Rosh Hashanah. Because all this liturgy, we didn't do all the liturgy. I mean, I think most of that came later. I think the issue is Melacha.
Yeah, we'll get to it. I mean, all the piyut, you clearly know, like piyut are all the liturgical poems that get like stuck into the middle of the Amidah and some other stuff. We will get to it, but Zichronot, Malchuyot, and Shofarot are in the Gemara. And so those are things that are, we absolutely have to do, but they're appended to the Musaf.
But it's
and
still
therefore,
after, right, which is still later than the Mishnah.
Which is right. So yeah, I don't have a good answer for you. I mean, I I like to live in the, I'm not a like, it has to have been this way. Let's look at the Tosafot and hash this out for the next 3 hours.
Right. No. But
I'm a
even
live in the mystery guy.
But even if it's something, even if, Zichron HaMelchiot Shofrot or something that has to happen during the day on Rosh Hashanah, once you get a testimony, as long as it's not too late, we're talking about versus, till midday, you could still get it done that day. Versus we're talking about Malacha, that goes back to the beginning of the day, which is problematic at any point.
Yeah. There is a monster Tosafot on this, by the way, but it's mostly focused not on the meta issue, but the micro issue. The micro issue being, what were the Levites confused about? Which is the same issue, really, which is like, what exactly were they doing if they hadn't already arrived to decide what the psalm should be, right? Were they confused about whether they do the psalm of the day or the psalm of Yom Tov, or what, right? Like what else could they have been messing with? All right, Judy, go ahead. I muted you while your phone went off. You're a very busy lady this morning.
Oh, don't even go there. It's a sitcom.
Oh, no. I hope it's okay.
Could do this on TV. The Golden Girls repeated. Okay, so I'm going to say something very basic. I had forgotten about the fact that the liturgy, a lot of liturgy was added. Thank you, Ilanit. Yeah. Thank you for reminding me of that. And I was even wondering if the influence of the Arab culture is the reason why we have so much liturgical poetry, because they were very big on poetry. But to get back to this, what I love about this is so basic, is the fact it's practical rabbinics. Something went wrong in actuality, and that's what they're dealing with. That's my take on it. In other words, something happened where in fact they recited the wrong psalm. And in retrospect, they really realized that, so that now they come forward to make this rule.
Yeah. I'll just
it's not esoteric. It's very, very basic.
It is. And I'll just recite what Rabbi Steinsaltz says in the Hebrew, which will slightly clarify, but it's his editorial comment about when this took place. And he says it the way that makes the most sense, but it's not exactly the way the words on the page say it. This is what we call in Talmud learning it outside, as opposed to learning it inside. Learning it outside means there's a logic that has to be applied, even though the words in the Talmud don't exactly say it this way, which is really confusing. But it's basically, we have to use our brains, knowing all the other information we know, in order to make the Talmud make sense. Otherwise, it's total chaos. Steinsaltz says, "Barishona b'tchila yamei habayit hayu mekablin edut hachodesh kol hayom." Back in the old days, one would receive witnesses for the new month all day. Rosh Hashanah, all day on Rosh Hashanah. She'im higiu edim memakom rachok, that if there are witnesses from far away, ha'idu shera'u et hamolad hayerach balayla hakodem, that if witnesses arrived from a place that was far away, they would attest that they saw the new month, the new moon, balayla hakodem, on the night previous. I don't know if that solves our problem at all, but what we're saying is the witnesses have to see the new moon, and then they have to get to the temple to then tell everybody to do it. And it's that gap of time of coming that that tells them. But to, I think, Marian and Elisheva's point, if they're seeing the new moon the night before, and then they're traveling to Jerusalem, and they arrive, early in the morning or even in the middle of the day, if it's a long walk, then the assumption is that they are attesting to Rosh Hashanah being today on Rosh Hashanah, right? Which is such a mess with the liturgy, but that's exactly what we're kind of like, why we're dealing with it. All right, let's keep going, because otherwise we're going to get caught up in this. Strangely enough, our rabbis in the Talmud do not get caught up on this. They just say this matter-of-factly and move on. This is the way it was. It seems counterintuitive or strange to say it's now Rosh Chodesh, but apparently this is how it worked. All right, with that, Marian, will you read this for us? We're glad to have you back with us.
Thank
after
you.
your big trip, right? How was your big trip?
No, it was a Hadassah conference in Jerusalem,
Oh, okay.
2 days, and it was
Good.
very good.
Excellent. Great. Okay. I'm going to read these. Did we do this one line? No, we did not do this one
I
line.
don't think so.
V'im ba'u edim min ha-mincha ulamala nohagin oto hayom kodem ulamachar kodesh. Sorry, hayom kodesh ulamachar kodesh.
And if witnesses came from Mincha time onward, although the calculations for the dates of the festivals would begin from the following day, the people would nevertheless observe that day on which the witnesses arrived as sacred, so that in future years, they would not treat the entire day as a weekday and engage in labor from the morning on the assumption that the witnesses will arrive only after Mincha time. And they would also observe the following day as sacred. On the second day, they observed Rosh Hashanah in full, both by sacrificing its offerings, as well as by calculating the upcoming festivals from that date.
So then, well, don't worry, we're going to get into it in the Gemara, so we're not going to spend too much time on it. But basically, if the cutoff date was established as Mincha for when we can determine whether it is Rosh Hashanah or not, and your witnesses come at, like, let's say Mincha falls, the Mincha time, the final Mincha moment is 5 p.m. That's just a completely made up number, but it simplifies things, because to get into when should you say Mincha is literally an entire other parak of the Talmud in Brachot that we don't have time to get into. And by the way, it's just as chaotic and crazy as you would imagine the rabbis to be. And that is why when you look in a synagogue bulletin and it says Mincha falls at 5:18, you should recognize that that is a rabbinic determination that has very little to do with what the Talmud is arguing about, but anyway, or a lot to do with it, but it's not, it's a determination that took thousands of years to get to. Anyways, let's say it's at 5 o'clock. The witnesses arrive at 5:02. The question that the Mishnah establishes is, okay, so does that mean that it should be Sunday and Monday should be Rosh Hashanah, or Monday and Tuesday should be Rosh Hashanah? And the answer is, let's just say that it's going to be Sunday and Monday no matter what, because we're going to really screw up the calendar if we're just going to base everything on this. I think the implication also that we're learning from this, practically speaking, is the walk from wherever the rabbis were walking from to intercalate the month, which is a distant hilltop, right, is far enough that this was probably a reasonable problem, right? I don't know how many of you have taken a walk from even Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. I'll tell you a quick story. When me and Iggy went to the Kotel Shivyoni, the egalitarian Kotel, when he was a little guy, like when he was like 4. By the way, how do you convince a 4-year-old to go see the Western Wall, to take a long walk to go see the Western Wall? You tell them we're going to see the castle, right? So we went to the castle.
And
but we went,
we get ice cream afterwards.
it might have been Shabbat, but yes. Yeah. So we get to the Kotel, and the egalitarian Kotel, which is kind of on the other side of Robinson's Arch, and there's a man and his son there, and we start to speak, and he tells me, they're kind of sweaty and grungy, and they're wearing like comfy clothes, and it's uncommon to see people in shorts and t-shirts at the Kotel, and they have this look on their face of like, where are we and what is this? They're Israeli. And I said, it looks like you've never been here before. This is the Kotel Shivyoni. This is the egalitarian Kotel. And I told him a little bit about it. I said, it looks like you walked here. And he said, yeah, me and my son have been, we hiked here from Tel Aviv. We took I think it was a 2-day trip. And we walked up from the coastal plain, not on the highway. Don't worry. They found a nice hiking trip, but he was like doing this the way our ancestors did it thousands of years ago, which is shalosh regalim, like al haregel, like on your feet, walking up to Jerusalem, and it took him, a full day, right? So if we're trying to figure out like what's going on here, this comes to mind when I'm thinking of like people used to walk, and it took a long time, and apparently you could not cite the new moon from Jerusalem. So there needed to be witnesses coming from elsewhere. Okay, so let's keep going. Paula, why don't you do this one in the English? You'll do 8 and 9 because they're short. Mishachara Beit Hamikdash hitkin Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai shayu makablim edut hachodesh kol ha-yom.
After the temple was destroyed and there was no longer any reason for this ordinance, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted that they would once again accept testimony to determine the start of the month the entire day.
Fantastic.
All right,
keep going. Gemara, ma kilkel kikule haleviim bashir. Hacha targimu shelo amru shira kol ikar. Rabbi Zera amar she'amru shira shel chol im tamid shel beit ha'arbaim.
Gemara. The Gemara asks, what error did the Levites make with regard to the song they were supposed to recite? The Gemara answers, here in Babylonia, they interpreted that they did not recite any song at all, as they did not know which psalm should be sung, the one for an ordinary weekday or the special one for the festival. Rabbi Zaira said, their mistake was that they recited the song of an ordinary weekday with the daily afternoon offering. After the witnesses testified, it became clear that they should have recited the psalm of the festival.
Okay. So again, back to kind of the clarification, the rabbis are disagreeing about what the disagreement is about. They're not entirely sure which of the two possible psalms of the day might have been done, right? Either you do say the psalm for the holiday, or you don't say the psalm for the holiday, or you say the psalm for the weekday or the special one for festival, or it's the weekday one and the daily afternoon one, right? And there are different psalms, right? And this seems like an academic and theoretical problem, but it's important for the rabbis to kind of understand like which of these psalms might they be arguing about. So they're going to try and suss this out and figure this out on their own. All right, Rabbi Judy, will you read this to us? It's a longer chunk. It's long in the Aramaic. Amar lo Rabbi Zera la'ahava bare, puk tani lahu. Hitkinu shelo yihu mekablim edut hachodesh ele kadei sheyehe shahot bayom lahakriv tamidim umusafim uniskehem. Velomar shira shelo bishibush. I amrat bishlema amor shira dechol hainu ika shibush. Ela. I amrat lo amur klal my shibush ika.
I was already unmuted. Rabbi Zera said to his son, Ahava, go out and teach the following braita to the sages of Babylonia. They instituted that on Rosh Hashanah, the court would accept testimony to determine the start of the month only if there was enough time left in the day to sacrifice the daily offerings and the additional offerings of the festival and their libations, and to recite the appropriate song without a mistake. Granted, if you say that they recited the song of an ordinary weekday, this is a case in which there is a mistake. However, if you say that they did not recite any psalm at all, what mistake is there?
Okay.
The term mistake indicates the performance of an incorrect action.
Okay, great. So Rabbi Zera is a Tannaitic rabbi. Maybe he's a late Tana. And he says, go and tell the rabbis in Babylonia that their logic is, he must be an Amora, but I don't know why he's Rabbi Zera. He should be Rav. but it's Amar, so it's an Amaraic statement. I guess my guess is that Rabbi Zera, yes, now I know. Rabbi Zera is a Palestinian rabbi who is saying Puk Chazi or Puk Tani, go, and Puk means go in Aramaic. And he says, go to Babylonia and tell them this. And he tells them there's a Baraita which proves which is a kasha for our section, which implies that, very simply, that there must have been this idea that there was a psalm to say on this day, and if they recite it, they should recite the correct one and not a mistaken one. And that Baraita implies that the argument is between one psalm and another psalm, and not one psalm and nothing. Sorry, other way around. It implies that you either say a psalm or you don't say a psalm, but not that there's two specific psalms that you're debating. So the kasha that he brings to this is then that there's a logic that if you recite a psalm which is incorrect, all right, that's a mistake and that would be bad. But if the debate is between reciting a psalm or not reciting a psalm, and you don't recite a psalm, what's the problem? Okay, reciting a psalm in error seems to be, at least according to Rabbi Zera's logic, worse than reciting no psalm at all, right? I think this is based on a rabbinic idea, which is a bit of a stretch, but there's a basic idea in rabbinics of a bracha levatla, right? A bracha levatla is a blessing that is invalid, right? Better you should say nothing in prayer than you recite the wrong prayer or a prayer that is invalid or nothing, right? Let's pretend that I was to say, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, hamotzi lecha min haaretz, and then I ate no bread. That would be bad for the rabbis, because that is a blessing that then didn't get used on anything, right? The rabbis would prefer you not act. So in the halachic logic that we're kind of applying in this case, right? The rabbis would prefer you stuffed a piece of bread in your mouth without reciting a bracha, which is not a good thing to do, but that would be preferable to the opposite case, which is reciting a blessing and then not utilizing it for anything, or reciting the wrong blessing over something, right? That's the logic that's being applied here, which is, and what they're doing, by the way, is they start with this phrase, and I knew where it was going. Iyamrat b'shlema, right, is where they say granted. Iyamrat b'shlema. If you say the following, it's shalom, it's peace, it's all good. But then it ends with ele, however, right? If you say it this way, it's fine, but it doesn't say it that way, and therefore we have a problem. So the rabbis have introduced a logical problem with the supposition they've just laid down, right? And so they're going to continue challenging it. Okay, so that's a little bit tricky. I even got confused myself in the middle of it. I think I sorted it out, and we'll keep going because the Gemara will explain itself further. All right, we are, Rich joined us late. Rich, do you want to read 11 to us if you're still there? Rich is listening in passively or can't unmute. All right, Elisheva, why don't you read 11 to us? Kevan de la amar klal, ein lecha shibush gadol mizeh.
The Gemara explains, since they did not recite any psalm at all, you do not have a mistake greater than this. The failure to recite the appropriate psalm disrupts the entire sacrificial service.
Okay, so if your logic was, well, it's probably preferable to say no psalm at all than to say the wrong psalm, and therefore that is the logic that we're holding to is in this argument of like, what was we're going back all the way to the beginning of the Gemara, right? What was the mistake that the Levites were making? Was it between two possible psalms that should be said based on when the witnesses came to the Levites to testify? Or is it between one psalm, a specific psalm for the day, and no psalm at all? And one rabbi, Rabbi Zera, says the argument is basically it's probably between one psalm and no psalm at all, because that would be a lesser problem. And the Gemara replies, honey, that's not how it goes down. If you recite no psalm at all, that's a lot worse than reciting the wrong psalm for the wrong day. For what the failure to recite the appropriate psalm disrupts the entire sacrificial service. The interesting thing is that the way Steinsaltz explains that, it implies that it's the appropriate psalm, which would apply really in both cases. If you don't recite the right psalm, whether it's an incorrect psalm or no psalm at all, it's bad news bears, right? Like it's bad news either way. All right. But at least we've solved one halachic argument, which is the halachic argument of Rabbi Zera saying like, don't say a psalm at all, and then you're fine. It's like, no, girlfriend, that's not going to work here. All right. Marianne, do 12 for us, right? Rob, Judy, you wanted to ask something?
Another basic comment. So
Yeah.
the sin of omission isn't really an issue for them. It's
Here.
Not here, right, but elsewhere for sure. Yeah. Okay, that's my only interesting. It's an interesting.
Yeah.
It's an interesting. This segment is interesting for many reasons. One of which is they're not that concerned if you actually don't do it. They're more concerned, obviously, with you do the wrong thing.
Yeah. No, it's really good. It seems like there's an argument as to the case. The Gemara seems to think that not doing it is worse than doing the wrong one. Rabbi Zera seems to be holding the other way. We could interpret the fact that
so in fact, the majority opinion is that that sin of omission is a greater sin.
I wouldn't say it's a majority opinion. So Rabbi Zera is, I'm pretty sure, an early Amora.
Right.
And the Gemara, it's the omniscient voice of the Gemara that is coming in at the end, right? When you get when you get this kind of layer that gets thrown on there. So it says Amar lo Rabbi Zera la ahava bare, and then there's a period here, right? The period tells us that we're done with Rabbi Zera's objection. And then you get an E Amrat B'Shlema. And an E Amrat B'Shlema is the omniscient voice of our narrator. Now, the narrator of the Talmud, or the omniscient voice here, is not really a majority per se, Judy. It is a narrator, right? And the narrator of the Gemara purports to be semi-authoritative, but I wouldn't say that it's definitely the only legitimate voice on the page, or that it holds more weight. Sometimes when later halachic commentators go through, they'll pick kind of the last objection, but just because there's a last objection doesn't necessarily mean that that's the winner in an argument. So how are we holding right now? We're holding confusion.
The closing argument doesn't necessarily prevail. And that's interesting that the actual anonymous voice, the narrator, doesn't necessarily, that may not be the final judgment either.
Yeah, if you maybe at the end of class, if we have time. Steinsaltz does a thing that I really like. I don't know why Jeremy never liked this. Maybe it was because he had a different book, but there's something that the old school Israeli Steinsaltz has at the bottom of every page called Orach HaChalacha. And it goes back to a joke that I used to tell. I tell in this class all the time, which is when I learned Gemara with my teacher, Reb Mimi Feigelson, in a second year of rabbinical school. Reb Mimi was first year, second semester. Whenever Reb Mimi would want to paskin halacha, she would literally stand up and walk outside of the classroom and tell us what the halacha was, because she believed firmly that you should never do halacha in a Talmud class. I always found that adorable. I like it. I think it helps. But one of the things that Talmudic purists believe is that you should live in the confusion. You should live in the mystery. You should be okay with the fact that Rabbi Zera and the stam of the Gemara do not agree with each other. I kind of live in that too, which is not knowing whether an improper psalm is worse than no psalm at all is kind of a good position to be in. But we actually have an answer, which I'll get to at the end. But I don't think we're quite there yet. So we've got to still fight this out.
That should be a philosophy of life.
Living in the mystery.
Living in the mystery and the confusion, and managing to live that way.
Yes.
That's very frightening to a lot of people. Maybe that's one of the keys to our survival as a people.
Yeah. An observation I made to our sainted Rabbi Seth Adelson the other day when we were talking was that one of the differences between him and I is that I am very process oriented and he's very goal oriented. Now, he was a chemical engineer. So thinking about maybe there's a nice way to do this in a hippy dippy liberal humanities studies kind of way is a very Rabbi Goodman way of doing things. But a chemical engineer actually needs to produce a product for the client, right? Like there's a goal-oriented thinking is a good thing in a lot of things, right? Like we can be process-oriented about Shabbat morning service, but if Rabbi Goodman doesn't actually put together a Shabbat morning service, then we got problems, honey. So yeah, so there, I'm with you, Rav Judy, that like I'm a very process guy. I think that the Talmud is a very process book. And not surprisingly, the dean of my rabbinical school, Rabbi Bradley Artson, wrote a book a couple years ago, which is called Jewish Process Theology. And he studied all the great Christian process theologians and wrote a Jewish version of process theology. If you did not pick it up at Barnes & Noble or on Amazon, I am not surprised. Specific niche philosophy books by rabbinic sources based on Christian theologians is possibly the most certain way to make $0 as a publisher. But he did it. So, but process theology is very Talmudic and very based in, it's basically the theology is, to your point, Judy, that God is a process, that God is not an old man and it is far from an old man in a chair, you know, throwing down lightning bolts and so on. But like God is actually just the wrestling. God is the struggle, and not in the. And it's an interesting philosophy. And I can only kind of give you the Cliff's Notes of the Cliff's Notes version of process theology. But Talmud is very process theology. All right, let's keep going. I think we're up to Marion in terms of readers. Meitiv Rav Acha Bar Hun. Oh, by the way, one last thing to say that I think is adorable. Rabbi Zerus named his son Ahava. Those of you in Israel all know that that is, of course, the Hebrew word for an expensive skin care product made of mud from the Negev. No. Ahava means love. So the next time you see a hippy dippy name in Talmud and you think to yourself like, oh my God, or sorry, a hippy dippy name in modern America or in Israel, or you see some name and you're like, oh, that's a ridiculous name. The rabbis of the Talmud were naming their children love, right? So, you know, whatever people name their kids is fine. It's fine, Bobby. All right. Meitiv Rav Acha Bar Huna. Tamid shel Rosh Hashanah, Shachri Karev Kehilchato. Bamusaf, Mahu Omer, Har Ninu leElohim, Uzenu Hariu leElohei Yaakov. B'mincha, Mahu Omer, Kol Adonai Yachil Midbar.
Rav Aha Bar Huna raised an objection from a Baraita. With regard to the daily offering on Rosh Hashanah, in the morning, it is sacrificed in accordance with its regular halachot. That is, the Levites recited the regular psalm for that day of the week. When it comes to the additional offering of Rosh Hashanah, what psalm does one recite? The psalm that includes the verse, "Sing aloud to God our strength, shout to the God of Jacob." With regard to the daily afternoon offering, what psalm does one recite? The psalm that includes the verse, "The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness."
Okay, so Rav Acha Bar Huna seems to be giving his opinion as to what our problem is. And he's bringing a baraita, right? So we have an Amora bringing a baraita, which means it's basically like a lawyer in court bringing a piece of evidence as an authoritative proof, right? This client said, that Dave was at the grocery store on the night of the 25th, and therefore he couldn't have committed the murder, right? That's the way a baraita is used. It's brought as a piece of evidence in court that is a strong piece of evidence. What is Rav Acha Bar Huna using as his piece of evidence? What makes this piece of evidence strong? It seems to imply that there was a special psalm for Musaf that the rabbis of the Tanaitic era knew, right? And there was a different one for Mincha, right? Kol Adonai Yachil Midbar. Kol Adonai Yachil Midbar, Yachil Adonai, right? So Psalm 29, which we all know from Kabbalat Shabbat. And the other one, I don't really know. I don't know a song for Psalm 81. Maybe there is one, but I don't know one. So that seems to be a problem for Rabbi Zera before, who was making the argument that maybe it's better to say nothing because we're not really sure. He's implying that no, the problem is between two different psalms, one that's for Musaf, one that's for Mincha. And if they come too late, if the witnesses come too late and you're not sure which day it is, then you might have mixed up which psalm you would say, right? They show up after Mincha. They've already decided that they're already onto they've missed their opportunity to say the Musaf one, and they move along, or vice versa, right? Okay. I'm not entirely sure which one he thinks is the one that you would say. That's actually a good one to kind of suss out again with Tosafot, but definitely the simple answer that we're dealing with without getting into what the mistake specifically was is this is proof that saying the wrong thing is our problem, not saying nothing, okay? All right, let's keep going. Rob, Judy, or Paula, it's your turn, I think. Bizman shachal Rosh Hashanah lihiot b'chamishi b'Shabbat, shehashira shelo harnenu le'elohei uzenu, lo hayu omer b'shacharit harnenu mipnei shechozer v'kofel et haperek.
And when Rosh Hashanah occurs on a Thursday, whose regular psalm, even on an ordinary weekday, is sing aloud to our God, our strength, and the witnesses come before the daily morning offering was sacrificed, one would not recite, sing aloud to God, our strength, and shout out to the God of Jacob with the daily morning offering, because one goes back and repeats that section at the time of the additional offering.
Okay, so we now have a statement about what happens if the witnesses come too late to say the thing that you would have already said on Thursday, which even applies even on an ordinary weekday. So we have this weird case, this strange situation, which is if Rosh Hashanah pops up on a Thursday, there's this thing that we would say anyways, but it actually is supposed to be on Rosh Hashanah offered in the later part of the service. And it says, if the witnesses came before the daily offering, with the daily morning off, the shacharit was sacrificed, you wouldn't say this with the morning, but you would go back and say it at the time of the musaf, okay? So again, we've got this really confusing piece. I'm not entirely sure which argument this one fights against, except that it just continually confuses our issue of what happens when you're not entirely sure which day it is that you recite the thing. In the Talmudic debate thing that I talk about how sometimes Talmud is juggling 7 balls, for me, this is an 8th ball, right? Like at this point, I'm just kind of like, I'm not entirely sure. This just makes it more confusing. I'm not entirely sure which case or another this will prove. And I think that that's the point. I'm sure other rabbis would try and pull this apart and figure it out. But remember, we're just going to keep moving at some point because we could get stuck in and then we'd be in big trouble. Someone threw something into the chat. So Paula says, amazing that anything gets done. Yes, yes. All right, let's keep going. Rav Judy, let's have you read this one. Eila mahu omer, hasiroti misevel shichmo, ve'im ba'u edim achar tamid shel shacharit, Omer harnenu afal pi shechozer v'kofel et haperek. Go ahead, Rav Judy. Unmute.
Yes, sir, I unmuted. Rather, what does one recite? I removed his shoulder from the burden, which is referring to Joseph, who was set free from prison on Rosh Hashanah. In other words, the second half of Psalm 81 was recited with the morning offering, while the first half was recited with the additional offering. And if the witnesses came on a Thursday, after the daily morning offering had already been sacrificed, one recites, sing aloud to God at the additional offering, even though this means that one goes back and repeats that section again. This concludes the Braita.
Yes, that is, this whole Baraita is a great example of why you will find in your like Sim Shalom or your Lev Shalom prayer books, you'll find these moments where like it says, if it is we see these all throughout the prayer book, but if it is December 3rd, but it's past Shmini Atzeret, flip ahead and say the line below this one, but don't say this line, right? Like there are all these little funky exceptions in the prayer book of do this, but don't do this. The rules for Tachanun are a great example. Tachanun is said on the following days, flip back to page 74 to see the 438 examples by which Tachanun is not recited, you know? So we have this, but this one is a very specific one, which is in the event that the witnesses for the new moon come either slightly before or slightly after Mincha, it would change which psalm you say, and specifically it would change it even more so if it happens that it makes it so that Rosh Hashanah falls out on a Thursday, because the Thursday psalm might be said in the morning, but you might have missed your opportunity to say it in the morning, and you might have said it in the afternoon, but you may need to go back and repeat that section again. Some of you are probably still with me. That's great. I'm not even sure how much I'm with me because this is really, really convoluted. It's really difficult. All right, and they're going to keep going in, but we're doing a good job. We're making good forward progress because I see the bottom of the page coming up, which isn't actually going to save us or make our lives easier. So, Iyamrat B'Shlema, the rabbis are going to kind of get into it. And Marion, if you're still there and you can read for us, that would be great. Iyamrat B'Shlema, Kol Hecha de Mistapaka, Amrinan Shira Dechol, Hainu Ka'amar, Omro V'Koflo, Ela Iyamrat Lo, Amor Klal, My Omro V'Koflo.
The Gemara explains the objection from this Baraita. Granted, if you say that anywhere there is a doubt with regard to what to say, one recites the song of an ordinary weekday. This is the meaning of that which the Tana states. One recites the psalm for an ordinary weekday and then repeats it. However, if you say that in a case of doubt, no psalm is recited at all, what is the meaning of the clause, one recites it and repeats it?
Okay, so we're trying to kind of harmonize the idea of Rabbi Zera with the idea of the Gemara. So we're atom smashing two baraitot into one another in order to see if there is any way that Rabbi Zera's comment regarding not saying a psalm at all could be logically interpreted. It's entirely possible that Rabbi Zera is in error, or I think what the Talmud is understanding from this is that Rabbi Zera knew about this baraita above and still said the thing that he said, meaning maybe you'd be better off saying no psalm at all. And the Talmud's objection is, however, if you say in a case of doubt, no psalm is always recited, how could you understand this clause which appears in this second baraita, which is one recites it and repeats it, right? How could you say that how could you say we don't say a psalm at all and one recites it and repeats it? So we're going to do this last line at the top of 31a because it'll solve the the question. So we have another, by the way, that we're using Talmudic understanding. We have another Amrat B'Shlema followed by an Eila, right? The Amrat B'Shlema structure followed by the Eila structure is a Aramaic objection. And the nice thing about an Amrat B'Shlema is it's a challenge which will ultimately be satisfied, right? Anytime you see an Amrat B'Shlema Eila structure, it's a problem that the rabbis are throwing out. It's a hypothesis, and they're going to have a conclusion to that hypothesis. And there are a variety of ways in the Talmud that they will harmonize, they will solve the problem. And they use a specific one here. That's one of my favorites because it's simple. And I never purport to be the greatest Talmud in the conservative movement. I'd say I'm hoping on my best day to be an average Talmudist. But a Shani Hatam is a nice, clean one that we can understand. So, Marion, will you finish us off with the Shani Hatam? I have to read it first. Shani Hatam, de Shira de Yome He. Marion, unmute first.
You're muted.
The Gemara rejects this argument. It is different there, as in any case, sing aloud is the psalm of the day, either because it was an ordinary Thursday or because it was Rosh Hashanah. However, there is no proof from here that in all uncertain cases, they would recite the psalm for an ordinary weekday, as it is possible that they did not recite any psalm at all.
Okay, so Rabbi Zera's proof, Rabbi Zera's baraita about the possibility that there is no psalm recited at all. It feels like the last baraita might reject that out of hand as a possibility. That concept of not reciting a psalm at all is absurd. You would never do that. Rabbi Zera is off his rocker. He wasn't reading all the baraitot. He wasn't up to date with all the information, and we should reject him out of hand. You could make that argument until you get to this Shani Hatam. A Shani Hatam says it's different there, meaning this is an exceptional case, or this case does not apply in this case, right? We have a case that cannot be applied, right? It's like a lawyer brought a piece of evidence to court, and the court says that piece of evidence does not apply here because, and this is kind of funny, I think, the way that it's framed, that only applies on Thursdays, right?
Well, that's
it only
where
applies
it's the same psalm.
Right, and Elisheva nailed it, right? Elisheva, you should teach this class next time. You're all over this, which is the psalm for Thursday is a special exception, which the previous baraita is mentioning specifically because it's a psalm that is also utilized on Rosh Hashanah, and therefore it creates the difficulty of being omro v'koflo, right? It's omro v'koflo. But Omro v'Koflo does not apply to Rabbi Zera's statement because not all the weekday psalms, the other 5 weekday psalms, are not Omro v'Koflo. So on any day other than Thursday, Rabbi Zera's baraita might hold water. All right, we're a little over, but I promised you that I would share a little bit of what the halacha is for those who like spoilers. Who don't like being left in the dark. Actually, it's not so much spoilers, but Mazel Tov, Shehecheyanu v'Kiyamanu. We flipped to a new Steinsaltz page. We're up to 31a. We're going to start off there tomorrow. And in fact, he starts with a new sugya. That idea Shani Hatam Deshira Diyoma He is the end of an idea. So we will not review that next week. We will start absolutely at the giant aleph at the top of the next page, aka 31a line 2. But let me read to you. Oh, and I'm seeing he's got a whole chart down at the bottom. That's going to be real trouble. Always worry when Adin Steinsaltz, may his memory be for a blessing, puts a chart at the bottom of the page. Like, oh no, maybe I'll give you guys the chart in English, or I'll go looking for one if we have time. All right. The question that we're asking is, what would we do with witnesses for the month in the event that they come a little bit too late to testify to the new moon. So the halacha comes down like this. Takanat Rabban Yochanan. Misha Chara Beit HaMikdash. So it was a decree of Rabbi Yochanan. When the temple was destroyed, Hikin Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai decreed the following: Sheyu mekablim edut hachodesh kol hayom kulo, that we would accept the witnesses all of the day. Va'afilu bo edim bayom shloshim samuch l'shkia, and even if the witnesses came on the 30th day, close to shkia, meaning Ma'ariv had already been said on the day, and they come at the rising of the sun. Mekablim edutam umakdishim oto yom bilvad. We would accept the witnesses, and we sanctify them on that day alone. All right, and then he continues with another halacha on Shir Shel Yom. I don't know if that clarified a whole lot to you, but the time to accept the witnesses seems to be really late, according to that understanding. Shir Shel Rosh Hashanah, the psalm for Rosh Hashanah. Here's the final word on what psalm you say on Rosh Hashanah based on when witnesses arrive to declare the new month. But Musaf, actually, it's not even related to when they intercalate the month. It's just the Talmud telling us, or the Shulchan Aruch telling us when you actually say the psalm. Actually, let me see. I'm just double checking where this is from. Oh, this is from Maimonides. So this is Ramban's, this book right here. Something I can do at home that I can't do at synagogue, which is the Mishnah Torah. The Mishnah Torah is one of the 3 law codes that was used by the Shulchan Aruch to determine who wins. So the way that it went down is the Tur, the Rosh, and the Rambam all are 3 authoritative law codes. And the way the Shulchan Aruch generally ruled is when 2 out of the 3 hold by something, then that's the law. Typically, I would say probably more than 80% of the time, all 3 are in concurrence about what to do. But there are times when the Rosh says one thing and the Tur says one thing and Rambam says something different. And in that case, Rambam loses. In fact, there's a very small Sephardic school of Orthodox thought called Rambamists. They're not a big group of people. They're kind of like super dorks on some level, but they hold by Rambam and they do not hold by Shulchan Aruch, right? Which means there are a few practices in Judaism where they do something really radically different. In fact, the place where their stuff is really different is the prayer book, right? The prayer book that we use today is overwhelmingly based on Shulchan Aruch, even Sim Shalom, and the Rambam would have had a few differences in his prayer book. Okay, so the final line, B'musaf shel Rosh Hashanah, hayu halevi'im omrim, harnenu le'elohim ozenu. So on Musaf of Rosh Hashanah, the Levites would say, Harenu le'elohim ozenu, which was the Psalm 81 that we saw before. V'im chal Rosh Hashanah b'yom chamishi, and if Rosh Hashanah falls out on Thursday, hayu omrim b'shachrit, in Shachrit they would say, hasireto mesevel shichmo, they would say this other psalm. Uba mincha shel Rosh Hashanah, hayu omrim kol Adonai yachiel midbar, they would say Psalm 29. I hope that clarifies everything for us. But that's what we do, right? We've actually separated out that we don't say this special psalm. We don't say this psalm and repeat it. We say a different psalm in its place. And the issue of, by the way, why does the Shulchan Aruch do nothing with what about when the witnesses come late? Which one do we say? The reality is the Shulchan Aruch already lives in a world where the calendar has been intercalated and the temple is not standing and there are no Levites. So it doesn't have to deal with that problem.
So much
The
for that.
calendar is set.
Right.
Hooray!
Right. All right, Elisheva, go ahead.
And apropos of this very point, didn't we way back, I don't even remember how long ago, say that even that they were in fact in those times able to make astronomical determinations of when the new moon actually fell and knew when it was, but relied on the witnesses for the sake of tradition, whatever. So in fact, they knew that sometime that day the witnesses would arrive because they knew when the new moon was.
Yes, but you're talking about a tension in a historical shift of practice, right? And the shift in the intention, the historical shift of practice is the calendar more important, or are the witnesses and the testifying more important? And in temple times, it was the latter. And
Yeah.
after the destruction of the temple, it's the former. The other thing that happens early in our Talmud, which I think only Paula was around for, because none of the rest of you had moved to Pittsburgh yet or had formed this relationship yet. Eleni hadn't even moved here yet. But me and Paula remember back in the old days, 4 years ago, when we used to meet at 61C for coffee, which we would never do again because it's too noisy and we couldn't do it online. We went through the whole issue at the very beginning of Rosh Hashanah, where we learn why Rosh Hashanah and all of the other holidays are 2-day holidays, which is that once they declared the new moon, they had to communicate it to Bavel. How do they communicate it to Bavel? You have to watch the second movie in the Lord of the Rings series to get a good sense of this. They used to set up bonfires at the top of hilltops, and the bonfire system would go all the way to the Euphrates and the Tigris River, right? And then the Jews in Bavel would know, it's going to be Rosh Hashanah. But according to the Talmud, there were some tricksters in the non-Jewish community, and they knew that they could screw up the Jews by going up to the hilltop a day early or a day late, or run bonfires for 4 days straight and send up a fire at night. And the Jewish community in Babylonia would screw up the day for Rosh Chodesh. And from that day forth, the decree was made that in the diaspora, we hold by 2 days. Now, the ironic thing that Elisheva is going to say here is that we now have a completely scientifically precise calendar based on both the lunar and the solar calendars. And we don't really need witnesses or a bonfire system. And therefore, we don't really need 2 days of Yontiv. And the response to that is, you're right. And that's why a rabbi in Boston in the conservative movement about 30 or 40 years ago declared that second day Yontiv is stupid and we're not doing it anymore. He wrote a tshuva, which exists and is, but is not part of the conservative movement official body of tshuvot, and I don't know why.
It shouldn't be.
But you can tell me, Israelis, whether David Golinkin holds by it. The answer is Golinkin is typically pretty frum in Israel, and usually if it's a new tshuva, we don't hold by it. Elisheva, go ahead, and then we'll wrap up.
The reform movement doesn't do the second day for that very reason. I have always held that
That's
while
not
it is
true. The second day is done at many
really
reform
the ones that I know don't.
in the
any
United
case,
States. No,
Yeah.
not
Oh,
here.
I understood that
Top-
they didn't.
Many of the top congregations do the second day.
okay, in Western Massachusetts, they
Interesting.
don't.
I don't think we do
In any
it
case, the
Pittsburgh
point
either.
I'm making is that akin to, even if they could calculate it, it was more important to listen to the witnesses in the temple. I have always held that even though we can calculate and we don't need the second day in the Galut, it's important to remember that we are, in my case, were in the Galut. And I mean,
Yeah.
it's a weirdness of mine. None of my friends liked me for it, but I think it's important to remember that differentiation.
Yeah.
And for that reason, I always held with second day, even though technically it's not necessary.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I think it's a really beautiful
Yeah, I
idea and a
agree
good
with
place to
that.
finish, Elisheva. You definitely were you were the Babe Ruth of this class today. You were crushing it left, right, and center. So well done. There's two things that I think I learned out of this. One is it's hard to change what you've been doing, right? It's hard to change. And the rabbis are really uncomfortable with abrogating the concept of the two witness system. They know that they can look up in the sky and figure out when it really should be the first day of Rosh Hashanah based on the rotation of the stars and the shifting of positions. But they don't go by that because it was based on lunar movements and the new moon, and they can't get away from that. Right? They have a system, and it doesn't actually work, but they believe in it, right? They believe in it. That's thing one. And thing two is, Elisheva, you bring up that our Talmud, and really this parak very specifically, because it's so focused on Jerusalem and what they did in Jerusalem, and whether we blow the shofar in Jerusalem, and whether the witnesses came before the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, right? That the primacy of Israel in the life of the Jewish people as a physical place is really important, right? The physical place of Jerusalem and of Israel is unchangeable, right? And I think it speaks to why there is a great debate today in the Jewish community about the state of Israel, about the policies of the state of Israel, so on and so forth. But the place itself, regardless of how it's run or who's running it, is a sacred place. And there is no arguing that whatsoever, right? And the place of Jerusalem. And also there's another thing is one of the great conversations that we had in rabbinical school in the Jewish community was, and the great promulgator is Zionist history of this philosophy was a guy by the name of Ahad Ha'am. Ahad Ha'am's philosophy was that he was referred to by some of the Zionist thinkers as a cultural Zionist. And Ahad Ha'am, when we say culture, we don't mean like they're going to invent Israeli dance and Neta's going to win Eurovision someday, right? But that there would be a primacy of Israel in the mind of the culture and the religion of the Jewish people. And it's not by coincidence that Adin Steinsaltz's book is translated into modern Hebrew, and that his book is one of the most important Talmudic voices out there, right? And it's not by accident that a lot of North American rabbis will go to the Shalom Hartman Institute on the summers to learn Judaism, right? Because Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, right? Like out of Zion goes forth Torah, right? There is a primacy to Israel and Zionism, and not Zionism, and Torah, that they're doing great things in Israel with Torah scholarship and Judaism and Israeli dance and winning Eurovisions and so on and so forth. The tension, of course, is that I think Israelis sometimes need to remember that there was a robust communication line to Bavel, that having a relationship with the diaspora is always important. All right, I'm going to finish there.